We have a number of people with us this morning during this webinar. First one I'm going to introduce is I normally wait till the end, and then sometimes I forget, but it's Ernie Nicely, who's our technical person, and without this, none of it would work. One thing that you do have, I can probably mention it now, on the PowerPoint for today's webinars is there's a link posted on the page that you'll look at for the webinar. So you'll see a link on there under chat.
Yeah, under chat on your control panel, you should see the link.
And that will take you to the PowerPoint if you want to make a copy of it, or after the webinar is over, you would have that available for you. So we really appreciate Ernie putting that on there for us. With us today, we have Janice Palmer from ASBA. Tim Ogle is with us from ASBA. Chris Thomas from ASBA, and Jeff Esposito from ASBA. Not many people from the School Boards Association to equal one person from ASBO, but you can make that conclusion yourself if you want. So.
Well, we have everybody listening in. I just want to compliment the lobbying team because many of the successes that have been experienced over the last 4 months have gone unspoken, but this group of professionals has been at work all day, every day, making sure that we got the best result. And we'll never know what might have been, but there were a lot of might have beens that were cut short, and we'll let them tell some of these stories. So thanks to this team.
Tim, thanks for those kind words. We'll start out with the fiscal year 2016 budget, and this year it was completed a lot earlier than any year that most of us can remember. The Auditor General and the Department of Ed are working on the budget forms as we speak. They'll probably have those out sometime around the middle of May, if not earlier. So first thing is the formula was adjusted, and 2 adjustments were made. One is the inflation adjustment, which was an increase of 1.59%. And just to remind everybody, according to Prop 301, the inflation increase is whatever inflation was in the prior calendar year. So for next year, as we start fiscal year 16, it'll be the inflation for calendar year 14. So it's whatever inflation was for the last calendar year, and it was at 1.59%, and the legislature did provide that adjustment. Remember, and we'll talk a little bit later about the inflation lawsuit, but the legislature, at least for the last couple of years, even though there was a number of years where they did not fund inflation, at least for the last few years, they have been funding inflation. It was 1.59%. That'll make the base level increase to $3,426.74. That does not include teacher comp. In the past, we used to say, and it also did not include the career ladder adjustment, but since career ladder has been eliminated, that adjustment no longer is available, but the teacher comp would be added to that number for all the districts that qualify for teacher comp. The other part of the inflation adjustment, and it's been referred to as kind of a down payment on the inflation lawsuit, but what's interesting is no specifics have ever been released that I'm aware of, or that anyone that I know of has, in terms of how this all fits together. But there was an additional $54.31 added to the base level, but it makes it real clear in the budget that that's not part of the official base level. So in future years, that wouldn't be adjusted by inflation automatically because of Prop 301. It's an approximate 1.6% increase. And in talking to the Department of Ed, they do say that that extra increase to the base level will count for teacher comp, will be added to that, and also for your overrides, you'll be able to use the full amount, which is the $3,400 base level plus the extra $54.31 as you calculate your override amount. But it's not part of the official base level. The next slide is other changes to the funding formula, and every year the legislature has provided an increase to the transportation funding formula. That's also a 1.59% increase. Districts have 2 amounts depending on what their calculations give them. They either get $2.04 a mile or they get $2.49 a mile, which currently, and those numbers would be increased to 204 would go to $2.07, and the 249 would go to $2.53 for fiscal year 16. Next one is charter additional assistance. And charter additional assistance, even the years when the base level was not increased, the legislature has always increased charter additional assistance. That also is getting a 1.59% increase. For the charter school additional assistance for preschool through grades K through 8, that brings the additional assistance up to $1,734.92 for fiscal year 16. And for grades 9 through 12, the increase goes to just over $2,000, $2,022.02. Next slide is the impact of reductions, because the legislature is continuing the reductions to district additional assistance and are even adding a new additional reduction. That new additional reduction is $113.5 million. And it's important, and we'll stress this a couple of times, that number is a savings to state aid. So the Arizona Department of Education is instructed to reduce district additional assistance to save the state $113.5 million. They actually have to make a larger reduction than that for a couple of reasons. One is that there's 38 districts that receive no state aid for either elementary and or their high school students. But the legislature requires the Department of Ed to reduce those districts by whatever amount the other districts are getting. To save $113.5 million, they have to actually cut district additional assistance by more than that, because it gets spread out among those districts that don't get any state aid, still are part of the reductions, and we'll talk about some details of that shortly. And they're continuing, the second bullet there is districts with $1,100 or fewer students, the total reduction cannot exceed $5 million for next year in district additional assistance. And that means that that same language was in this year's budget. So for those districts with 1,100 or fewer students, their reduction in district additional assistance for next year, unless there's changes in students and other factors, really remains the same, because it's the same $5 million limit. That makes a larger reduction required for the other districts, and we'll talk about that in more detail shortly. Well, the impact of reductions on district additional assistance, and districts have had a really difficult time, and I know I've gotten a lot of questions, and so have others, about, well, how can they calculate what the reduction will be? And it is extremely difficult, but we tried to put at least as much information together as we could to help people understand how that additional reduction is going to work, because it's on top of the existing reduction. And I want to thank Lyle Friesen from the Department of Ed. He's been a big help in helping trying to put this together. He's actually done some simulations to come up with a projected dollar amount. But the $239 million in state aid that was cut in 2015 for this current year, the Department of Ed actually had to reduce district additional assistance to districts by $259.8 million to save the $239 million. The additional new reduction for next year, the $113.5 million reduction, it's estimated that it'll have to be an additional cut of $123.4 million to district additional assistance, and we talked about that earlier about the non-state aid districts are the major reason for this. So they have to make this larger reduction to save the state for next year an additional $113.5 million. The total reduction then for fiscal year 2016 will be $352.4 million. We and others who have looked at it estimate that they'll have to make the cut to district additional assistance by $383.2 million in order to save the amount of money that is required to save the state, $352.4 million. The new reduction in state aid is a 47.5% increase from the existing reduction. Now we go to some additional information on the next slide to kind of explain what some of the impacts are going to be and why that's influencing the amount of the reductions. As we talked about earlier, the actual reductions will be impacted because districts with 1,100 or fewer students have already reached their $5 million maximum that was in place for fiscal year 15. So for that group of districts, the amount of the cut it will not go up. It's still a $5 million cap, though it may change a little bit from individual districts because of declining enrollment or growth in students. The actual reduction will be impacted also on a per pupil basis because there's over 30,000 students who were in the cut for charter additional assistance, and with the elimination of those districts from having district-sponsored charter schools, they will now be included in the cut to district additional assistance. So the reduction will be spread out among those 35,000 students because they're now part of this cut rather than the cut to charter additional assistance. And as I said, we've been working with the Arizona Department of Education to come up with some estimates. Next slide. After the district additional assistance of $238.9 million, that's the current reduction. And this is just to give people some background of how their district might compare to other districts. Is under the current cut of the reductions that districts are making to district additional assistance, 45% of that money was transferred out of district additional assistance after the cuts and transferred into maintenance and operation. In capital, there was actually 55% of the district additional assistance money stayed in capital, and but projected for district additional assistance. Now this would not be for the districts that have 1,100 or fewer students. This would be the projected reduction in terms of what would be left after the reductions are made. We're estimating, and in talking to the Department of Ed, they are estimating too that districts will only have about 15% of their district additional assistance left after this new cut is added to the existing cut. For districts with 1,100 or fewer students, remember their cut would stay about the same because the $5 million cap is still in place, and the Department of Ed is estimating for districts with 1,100 or fewer students, they would have about 29% of their district additional assistance available. And now I'll turn it over to Janice.
And so part of the initial budget recommendation was that from the governor's office was that these district additional assistance cuts had to also correlate to a 5% cut in non-classroom spending. All of that was removed, and a very, very big thank you to Peoria Unified, Snowflake Unified, and Kyrene Elementary. They were very integral in kind of showing the case studies about first what district additional assistance is, as Chuck mentioned, that many districts, 45% of those monies have been moved into the M&O formula, but also to talk about what really is classroom spending. And so none of the 5% mandate for non-classroom is in the final budget. In its place is a requirement for A and B districts, and this would be based on your letter grade as of this current year. It requires a public meeting to discuss the district's plan for the cut to district additional assistance. This can be the same meeting that you normally hold for your budget. And then you have to include the percentage of classroom spending on that budget, and the governing board members need to sign that document. And hold that thought, because as we go forward, what classroom spending means has also changed in session law, and we look forward to that becoming more permanent as we move forward. For C, D, and F districts, there's an extra step. Not only are you requiring a public meeting to present the district's plan for the cut to district additional assistance, but also requires a 30-day period for the public to provide their input for what cuts should take place. The district then needs to take a look at what the community has put forward, hold a final meeting for those cuts, and then again include the percentage of classroom spending in the district's budget. There is very significant intent language and I think that this can be something that we take forward into the governor's classroom first executive order, that the names of whom will be on that committee will soon be named. But in the budget includes intent language that districts increase the total percentage of classroom spending from the previous year. But the key point of that is that classroom spending is now being defined as instruction, instructional support, and student support. This has been something that we have talked about for a long time, districts have talked about for a long time, that it takes much more than just actually in the classroom to really support students and support their learning. And so while this is session law, in the budget, there have been discussions about making this more permanent, and like I said, this will be a central feature in the classroom's first conversation that Governor Ducey put out in the executive order. And so what does that actually mean, Chuck?
Okay, the first, just one other comment on this, that the change, or we can look, was actually brought about with a lot of effort by school districts who sent letters and emails and called their legislators and basically talked about how important a lot of positions are, counselors, nurses, people who work in special education, how important those individuals are to what goes on in the classroom, and many of their work takes place in the classroom or works on the instructional program. So that real change in what the legislature is looking at when it talks about classroom to make it more inclusive had a lot to do with the districts actually making a good impact on their legislators, explaining to them why it was needed to change. And this next one is just if it had been in place this year, the existing for 2014, that's how the existing definitions are put together, and you have administration, plan operations, and you can see student support at 7.9%, instruction support at 5.9%, and instruction at 53.8%. Under this new, as Janice said, session law change, basically for the classroom it now gets combined, and student support, instruction support, and just instruction would all be included, and that would make the total for those categories 67.6%. The next slide kind of shows nationally how would it look comparing Arizona to the rest of the nation using the new system of organizing the different areas. And basically Arizona's classroom spending by the 53.8% for instruction, 7.9% for student support, and 5.9% for instruction support is 67.6, just about 2/3 of the total dollars. And you compare that to the national average, which is at 71.3%. So we actually, when you include all those areas, because we are quite a bit higher in student support and instruction support, it gets us closer to what the national average is. Okay, the next slide is for charter additional assistance. The existing reduction is $15.6 million, $15,656,000. The new reduction is an additional $3 million added to that, so their total reduction for FY 2016 is just over $18.6 million. The thing with the charters is it's not as difficult for the Department of Ed to calculate because everybody gets full state funding for charter additional assistance with the charter schools because there's no local dollars, so you don't have any non-state aid charter schools in existence. So but it will be impacted by the reduction in the number of district-sponsored charter schools. Not that it changes the dollar amounts, but there'll be less students now to divide that reduction among. So for charter schools, the reduction for individual on a student-by-student basis will go up because it's divided up among less students, because there's now 35,000 less district-sponsored charter school students who will be in that calculation in fiscal year 16. But the reduction is made on a proportional basis, no process based on letter grades or whatever. All the charter schools get the same reduction and have the same budget process. The joint JTED districts, The first bullet there for JTEDs, and this is an existing law, is any JTED that has more than 2,000 students, they're only funded at 95.5% of what the state formula funding would say they should get. So that reduction stays the same. However, there is, starting in fiscal year 2017, a new set of reductions that would affect JTEDs and in some cases districts. Districts and charters will only receive 92.5% of the state funding formula for students who are in JTED satellite programs. So the district would only get 92.5% of the funding that they're normally getting, and the JTEDs would only get 92.5%. However, for students who would be in central campuses, JTED programs that are not satellite programs, the district will not have any reduction in funding for those students, but the JTED will only receive 92.5% of the funding that their formula would say they are getting, that they're supposed to get for students that are enrolled in a central JTED campus program. Districts and charters may use a portion of the JTED money that they receive to offset this reduction in funding, but the amount of money that they use to offset the reduction that they're going to get in 2017 for districts to offset that cut can't be more than what the actual cut or the reduction is to districts. And the other thing that was put in is that a district cannot prohibit or discourage students enrolled in a district from attending courses offered by JTED. Next one is district-sponsored charter schools. The legislature is saying that it's the intent of the legislature that district-sponsored charter schools are phased out by fiscal year 2016-17. So there'll be no more district-sponsored charter schools. There'll only be a limited number of them that will still be in place for next year, but they're all out of operation by 2016, 2017, and the legislature made clear that that was their intent. It permits a school district or charter school to operate their programs through June 30th of 2016, but for those limited districts that are still going to be allowed to have those district-sponsored charter schools, but they'll only receive in fiscal year 17 or fiscal year 16 50% of what they would normally get in extra money. So if they were normally going to get X amount of dollars extra because it was a district-sponsored charter school, they'll only get 50% of that money. And it repeals a session law that allowed district-sponsored charter schools that were operational prior to fiscal year 2014 to continue. The next one is just to kind of show you a little bit about some of the things that goes into the legislature when they do put their baseline budget together, which is their projected budget for to start working their session on. The JLBC, Joint Legislative Budget Committee baseline budget for fiscal year 16 had an extra $22.5 million in what it was going to cost the state beyond just an inflation adjustment and beyond just an increase in students. And there's two reasons for that. One is the higher proportion of students in grades K through 12 that are in charter schools, because charter school students cost the state more than traditional school students because 100% of their funding is from the state, and secondly, because charter additional assistance is so much higher, they actually cost more, and the legislature has $12 million put into the fiscal year 16 budget to cover that. And also special education students, the state is seeing more special education students proportionate to their regular population, and I'll show you some details on that shortly, but they put an extra $10.5 million in what it's going to cost the state in state aid for 2016 to cover that. The next slide kind of shows why that extra money is there for special ed students. And when you look in 2009, there were 941,000 total students in districts, school district programs, and 81,000 were special ed. And in 2013, even though the number of students in special ed, or total students, have dropped to 910,000, a $31,000 drop. There's actually 14,000 estimated actual special ed students in special ed programs in traditional school districts. So you can see we're getting more and more special ed students enrolled in traditional school districts and staying in traditional school districts. For charters, they both had an increase. They went from $100,000 students in 2009 to 140,000, but they also had an increase in special ed students, and they went from 3.2 to 4.6. So we are getting more special ed. I know I've talked to a number of districts and the impact that that's having on their budgets because of especially how the Group A students are funded, and just having more expense and more need for special programs because of the total increase in disabled students in the state.
And in the School Facilities Board, it requires the School Facility Board to annually publish a list of vacant and unused district buildings. This is not necessarily a new report as ADE currently reports it, but it is new that the School Facilities Board will be charged with that. And again, keep that in mind when we talk on the next slide about Access Our Best Schools Fund. Second item, for the first time, the SFB is to annually report all school district Class B bonds. They need to do that by January 1st of each year. And subsequently, school districts are now required to report their Class B bond approvals to the School Facilities Board by December so that they're able then to report it on a statewide level. Also within the budget requires the School Facilities Board to refinance, basically try to get a better refi rate for lease purchase payments. The next item, which was a pretty significant policy change but not a lot of detail, is the Access Our Best Public Schools Fund. And you've probably seen a lot of media around this, in that it appropriates nearly $24 million for the Access Our Best Public Schools Fund. That $23.9 million, $21 million of it comes from the old student success funding that was under Governor Brewer's charge. So that money has now been repurposed into this Access Our Best Schools Fund. And it requires the executive branch to submit an expenditure plan to the Joint Legislative Budget Committee. And to be clear, the Joint Legislative Budget Committee this is the actual subcommittee of the legislature, made up of legislators, that would approve this, not the JLBC that we many times think of as far as the budget analysts that help provide us with information. The actual committee for review and prior to the expenditure of funds, and the School Facilities Board is the entity charged with administering those funds. Just as a sidebar on this, this is one of those unprecedented items that we saw this year in the fact that not only was a significant amount of money appropriated, but for the first time we see somewhat of authority taken away both from the executive branch as well as the legislative branch, and the fact that the executive is having to get permission from the legislative branch, and then also that the legislature is actually punting the expenditure plan to a subcommittee of its own body. So it's very unusual, and we have yet to see what this actually looks like, except to say that there is the intent language in the budget that says that these monies are available to public schools that are part of the Public School Achievement District to construct new facilities or to expand existing facilities. Now again, what that looks like we have yet to see, but also keep in mind from the previous slide that the School Facilities Board is now going to be the same entity that is responsible for administering this Access Our Best Schools Fund is also the entity that will be reporting vacant and unused district buildings. The fund consists of those monies appropriated as well as other grants, donations from public or private sources, and there's also the requirement that at least 50% of the monies be used in low socioeconomic areas. Again, we have been in contact with the governor's office and the legislature, and we keep hearing that a plan is forthcoming, but no date certain as of yet.
Okay, rollover, nothing has changed with the rollover, but we wanted to remind people what it is, so especially any new people that might have come on board in school districts. The state continues to defer $930.7 million in basic state aid that districts will earn in 2016, and they won't actually be paid until after July 1, so it'll count against fiscal year 2017. The legislature has been doing this for a number of years. School districts have, in the past, have had experience with rollover. They've adjusted to it fairly well, because one of the things that districts need to remember that if the legislature was not doing a rollover, there would have to be additional cuts made somewhere in the budget. But one of the important things is, as time goes forward, the legislature does need to at least take a look at recouping and getting some of that money back into the current year, because if we have a downturn again sometime in the future, which most people think we're going to have downturns every few years or whatever, they would no longer have this to fall back on. So it's important for the legislature, at least long term, to consider how to get back out of this. But it continues to exempt districts with less than 600 students, so they would get full funding during 2016. None of their money would be rolled over into the next year. It requires rollover payments to be made no later than July 12th of 2016, so districts get their money quite early after the new fiscal year starts. That hasn't always been the case. There were times in the past where districts wouldn't get some of their money until October or November, but at least now you get the money relatively quickly. And it does continue the requirement that districts have to include the fiscal year 2016 revenue estimates, that money that's they're going to be paid in rollovers, so they wouldn't raise their taxes to cover that, because they know they're going to get the money. It's just going to be a couple of days late. The next one is cap on 1% limit on primary property taxes. As you'll see, as Janice and I talk about this, there's a lot more unanswered questions than there are answers of how it will actually work. At this point, I don't believe there's anybody in the state who knows exactly how it's going to work. There is some talk about even some possible lawsuits related to it. But basically what it is, that there's 33 districts in the state that when you add their property tax rate or their levy along with the other political subdivisions that are in that same area as that school district, the actual total primary property tax bill for a homeowner would be more than 1%, would actually be a rate of over $10, even after the additional state aid that normally comes to district is paid. So there's 33 districts where the homeowners in those districts cannot pay any more property taxes than 1% of the value of their homes. The actual tax rates for all the political subdivisions, including school districts, would put it over that 1% limit. And in the past, the state has always provided monies to the school districts, additional state aid, to lower the school district rate down to the point where it would get everybody back down under the 1% limit. This year, the governor's proposed budget changed that, and instead of having enough money available to do that in all cases, they basically said that they were only going to provide $1 million in assistance to each county. So Pima County, Maricopa County, Pinal County, La Paz County would all get $1 million to do that. In some cases, that's a lot more than what that county might actually have. In a number of cases, especially Pinal, Pima County, to bring the homeowners and all the political subdivisions down under that 1% limit take a lot more than $1 million. So now how is this going to be made up? That's the issue where a lot of people don't know exactly what it'll mean, because going over the 1% limit is takes all the school districts, it's not, and all of the political subdivisions added together. So this one is, people are struggling with it. I know, especially in Pima and Pinal County, they're taking a long look at that. How is this going to work? Because it looks like there won't be enough money coming in to bring everybody's tax rates down below the 1% limit. So who foots the bill? Who gets hit with the burden? And there doesn't seem to be a lot of answers. There just seems to be a lot of questions at this time.
And as Chuck mentioned, the 1% cap is a constitutional limit, but the state has always funded that in order to hold harmless the political subdivisions. And so as Chuck mentioned, there's a lot of questions about who pays what, because this includes community colleges, school districts, fire districts, library districts, all of that. So who pays what? And so there's a lot of consternation not only at the state level but at the local level of not wanting to infight between political subdivisions. And so we have been in contact with the Pima County lobbyist, and there is currently legal research going on and likely litigation coming forward from both Pima and Pinal County. Those are the ones, as mentioned, are the most effective right now. However, there are definitely school districts and others that will be on the docket into the future if this is not mitigated in some point, or at least made clear what the ramifications are for each political subdivision.
And there was a bill in the legislature that came out after the budget to try and provide specifics to this reduction, but there was so much controversy and so much misunderstanding and so much confusion that that bill just died. So it's kind of interesting. People realized what the problem was, but the bill that I think was 1076 that people had in place to try and solve it was making the problem worse. So there is no legislative language to say how this works, and that's becoming a real struggle for people.
So the last item of the budget that we'll talk about is that continuous funding of the Arizona Education Learning and Accountability System. It holds constant the funding for the data system. No additional, no less, just constant. And then the other item that somewhat got overlooked at the time, it was actually in Governor Ducey's State of the State and was part of the budget package, is a 2016 general election constitutional ballot measure to self-fund the land department. And why does that matter to us? As you have probably seen, the updated numbers for the Classroom Site Fund have come out, and those resources are a combination of sales tax revenues as well as trust land interest earnings. And so what this proposal would do would take up to 10% of those trust land earnings and reinvest them into the land department's operations, which is currently funded right now through the State General Fund. So in essence, we'll reduce funding to school districts with the understanding that by funding the land department, the hope is to earn more money into the future. This has already had a conversation of being sued, that the ballot measure is not constitutional or proper for consideration, and Tim Hogan is leading that charge. So whether that will actually make it to the 2016 ballot or have some kind of changes necessary to make it legal, we will yet to see. But it's another item that could definitely chip away at the monies coming into our schools. So now we'll head over to some of the bills that happened, and it was funny, Chuck and I were going through this, and while we felt like pretty good hockey goalies this year, you know, there was actually a lot of bills that were passed this year. A lot of them were just of smaller impact, but there's a lot of them. So all of the bills have been chaptered at this point in time, and we are just going to go through the ones that actually passed, have been chaptered, not the ones that were either vetoed, lost in the process as we get to the end of it. Jeff Esposito has been doing an awesome job of getting that all together in the comprehensive brief, which will be out the end of this week. The general effective date will be July 3rd. Amazing. As Chuck mentioned, it was one of the earliest budgets we've ever seen. This is probably one of the earliest times we saw bills go through, actually be start of the fiscal year. And then, you know, we couldn't have planned it any better, but today is a very special day because today was supposed to be the official 100-day signing die date. And we're obviously well past that with us signing dying on April 3rd. So the first bill, we were the first ones out of the chute with Chapter 1, House Bill 2064, which is required for students in high school graduation beginning in 2016-2017, that students will have to answer 60 out of 100 questions on a test identical to the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services exam. A student can take it as many times as he or she needs to. And also just puts the burden on the school districts in order to have that on the transcript to keep track of whether that child passed or did not pass. As you know, this seems like eons ago, but it was the first bill, and we were the first one in the nation to actually do this. But there are a lot of questions that remain. I would not be surprised if we see some legislation next year to clean up some of those items. Next bill is Chapter 5, Senate Bill 1191. This was not too far after, which is in essence going after Ames retakers, that now no student needs to obtain a passing score on a standardized test in 14-15, 16-17, or 17-18. Obviously exempts the civics exam from that, but keep in mind the civics exam is not until next year, and that has an emergency clause, which I know caused some consternation within districts because of that emergency clause happened right when retaking was taking place. So, but that is not required for any high school graduation. Chapter 35, Senate Bill 1077. This is one of those smaller bills that we will see throughout the rest of the webinar. Child care facilities, SFB guidelines. There was basically language added last year to bridge two very ungermane items onto a bill. and that allowed that child care facilities that use floor bedding rather than cribs at facilities would be able to be part of the School Facilities Board guideline. That's eliminated, and this was at the behest of the School Facilities Board. Next item, which I think is a good bill, Chapter 47, House Bill 2066, allows the public school extracurricular tax credit monies to be used for standardized testing fees for AP exams, IB exams, as well as career and technical education industry certification, prep courses, and other materials. So this is one of those issues that we have struggled with as associations, and the fact that there's obviously discrepancies of what school districts receive in their extracurricular monies, but as times are tough, it's one of the few areas that we're able to go to in order to provide some services to kids that may not have the resources to do so. So especially in some of the areas with Move On When Ready, you'll be able to use your extracurricular tax credit monies for AP exams on that.
Okay, Chapter 48, House Bill 2109. And I probably should have mentioned in the earlier opening remarks that we will hopefully have some time at the end for questions. So during the course of the webinar, you're welcome to type in questions that you might have, and we'll try to cover as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. There was a number of issues that came through the legislature this year that we're trying to make ballots, changes in ballot language. In many cases, we believe that as we talked to legislators, the goal was to make it more difficult to pass some things, but this bill is an example of it adds ballot language to the ballot for bonds to make it clear that if the voters vote yes, it's a secondary property tax, and it authorizes the governing board to issue and sell X number of bonds, and for those bonds to be paid with the secondary property tax, and that a no vote means not authorizing the governing board to issue and sell bonds.
Chapter 68, Senate Bill 1461, there's two portions of this. The first one has to do with teacher continuing education credits, and this allows any kind of training, screening, accommodation use of teachers, including dyslexia, to be used as their continuing education credits. The state board has to adopt rules in order to make that happen. The second part has to do with the Move On When Reading program, and specifically talks about students that are in the process of a special education referral or some kind of placement and diagnosed as having a significant reading impairment would have to have special accommodations in their reading plan if they were struggling. And specifically, the student diagnosed as having a significant reading impairment includes the language dyslexia. And so this was a hybrid way of trying to heighten the issue of dyslexia, making sure that any kind of reading intervention plans included this assistance, while at the same time not opening this up too much, so that we actually have a Move On When Reading program that really does help struggling students, but also does not move students that are not reading at proficient level. Chapter 76, Senate Bill 1289. This was the second biggest priority that we had this year, and this is the 2-year transition period as it relates to the A through F accountability system. So there will not be any letter grades provided to districts, charters, or specific district schools for 14-15, which, as you know, we're coming to the end of that. So we're already through year 1, if you will, and also through 15-16. But there's a lot of work to be done in the meantime. The State Board of Education had an A through F task force that started taking a look at what a real A through F accountability system would look like, and they adopted in December what those guiding principles are. And now it's time to do the work to figure out what those multiple measures are, to start profiling what the accountability system would look like. And that is what this legislation allows to happen. For that to happen over the interim, and then it requires that any proposed legislation for the 2016 legislative session on that revised accountability plan must be completed by the end of this year. And so you will see coming from the State Board of Education that these meetings will probably begin happening next month. So look out for that. But also this bill provides flexibility to a whole host of other accountability measures, most specifically as it relates to teacher and principal evaluations. 2 items on that. It provides flexibility. Districts do need to take proactive action to adopt an alternative policy if they so choose, but it does allow districts to have an alternative policy on non-renewal and dismissal policies, as well as that individual teacher performance pay component that went into effect this year. But it does allow that to happen for 2 years. There's also flexibility in there as it relates to move on when reading. The other item, and this was interesting, actually came up in a meeting last night, is that there is also the requirement that data will still be released, so that there will still be some level of accountability that's provided to the public, to policymakers, as well as to districts. But what that looks like has yet to really be defined. I think when we first started talking about it, it was graduation rates, it was AZ merit scores, but obviously those have yet to have context since we haven't done standard setting or cut score setting. And so some of that also will be done during the interim. Of note, the governor basically did about 10 or 15 letters with bills that he signed throughout the session, and this was one of the bills that he had a letter on, in requesting that the state board and others look at best practices of other states, also the feasibility of including local and statewide assessments as an option as it relates to the A through F accountability system, and a true emphasis on local control of curriculum and assessment tools as it relates both to the accountability system as well as to other accountability items that were included in the legislation.
Okay, Chapter 103, House Bill 2186, was brought forth by the County School Superintendents Association. I just want to comment, over the last few years, they have become a lot more active in the legislative process, and as a group really work together very well in terms of taking positions on legislation that impacts a number of education issues, but also that would impact the county school office. The first one was to expand the ability of the county school superintendent to work with library districts and municipal districts. The belief was that some counties were already doing that, but there wasn't clear legislation to allow it. And then the second one would allow a district governing board to enter into an IGA with library districts and municipal libraries where the district is located. So it just gives more flexibility. The bill really was initiated by the county school superintendents to make sure there was clear language that they were allowed to continue to provide those services. Chapter 108, House Bill 2302, state and federal monies, prohibits ADE from commingling federal monies. I believe the Department of Ed was saying during the legislative session that they already were prohibited from doing that, but sometimes the legislature wants to put something in the law 2 or 3 times to make it real clear that you aren't supposed to be doing something, even though one probably is enough. But it basically prohibits them from commingling federal monies and other monies.
Chapter 127, House Bill 2530. This is the first of about 3 bills on Arizona online instruction, and this has been something that has been an issue for some time. I think will continue to be until we have a major overhaul of the accountability and financial issues relating to it. But these are some of the smaller issues that have gone on, in that this bill, or this chapter bill, prohibits a district or charter from requiring proof of payment as a condition of the district or charter accepting credit. So as you know, in current law, districts and charters must accept Arizona online instruction credits. However, the default is those credits are accepted as extracurricular. Districts and charters are allowed to have a test in order to count those credits as core curriculum, but that is up to the district or charter to so do so. But we do have to accept the credits, and this is saying that we cannot require proof of payment for those happening, and it specifically applies to a student who is enrolled in summer school at an AOI. And specifically, this had to do with a lot of East Valley school districts and Primavera, and we continue to have that conversation. It also includes session law that's repealed as of June 30th, 2018, that outlines a process for a district, a charter, or an AOI in order to get a student's transcript within 10 days. There was a funding issue that was happening between both the districts and the AOI as far as holding on to transcripts, who was able to access those transcripts, and this now requires that to happen within 10 days or face a penalty of $50 per day for noncompliance. Chapter 141, Senate Bill 1074, this basically says that if a school district decides to sell or lease a vacant or unused building, that district cannot discriminate against a charter school who is up for that lease. And we think that's current law, but as Chuck said, sometimes we reiterate what current law is. And it also requires a district to obtain the highest possible value under the market conditions. So this, just to be clear, because there was a lot of holdover from last year and some of the legislation was there, this is just if the district, the impetus is on the district to actually go out for sale or lease of a facility, and at that point there can't be discrimination. However, there's still the requirement to get the highest market value. But if that highest market value is with the charter, then that is the expectation of who the sale or lease would go to. Chapter 145, Senate Bill 1093, this prohibits a district or charter from charging a fee for those examinations that a district may request to have in order for any of the AOI, any of the Arizona Online Instruction courses to be counted as core competencies, what we just mentioned a couple slides ago. Again, we think this is current law, that you can't charge a fee for any testing. You can obviously do the test, you just can't charge a fee. Now this is put in law, and it requires the assessment for those core competencies to be an end-of-course exam that is aligned to the state academic standards. Chapter 147, Senate Bill 1117, this basically changes Arizona Online Instruction from the State Board for Charter Schools. That was where they were getting their authorization to basically a state-approved charter authorizer. This is more of a technical issue and more of an accountability streamlining issue that the State Board for Charter Schools had asked for. Chapter 152, Senate Bill 1169, this had to do with codes, especially as it related to the School Facilities Board and what was and was not required for fire code. So it allows, the biggest part of the bill basically allows that if the state fire code or municipality, that it allows an employee who works at the building to serve as the fire watch. There was some consternation about duplicative employees having to serve in this capacity in order to comply with the city and county regulations. But there was an item that was specific to school districts, and it provides that exception under the School Facilities Board minimum adequacy guidelines that a school with an aggregate area of less than 5,000 square feet is subject to permitting and inspection by the local fire marshal and is not subject to the local regulations and the local fire watch issue. So this is for some of the smaller rural districts. This was especially an issue in Senator Sylvia Allen's area, and I think it has been worked out now where the School Facilities Board, districts, and others are happy. Chapter 157 directs the Department of Education to issue exemptions for districts and charters to have bake sales, in essence. This was an interesting piece of legislation because the Superintendent Diane Douglas had already come out with a press release and intention of allowing these exemptions, and this state law followed behind it. Chapter 217, House Bill 2483. This is another one of the good bills I think we can see from this session, in that it provides parity between the private school tax credit and the public school extracurricular tax credit in the area of when those contributions can be made. So now both contributions can be made up to April 15th, up to when your taxes are due, and then you can choose to take that tax credit either in the previous tax year or in the subsequent tax year. That is up to you, but it allows some flexibility and hopefully provides some other opportunity for school districts to receive those tax credits. That change was made to the private side, what, Chuck, 1 year, 2 years ago?
2 years ago.
2 years ago. And there was a big change. There was a significant change in the number of tax credits that the private schools received. And
the dollars went up significantly, so I think this will mean a big potential increase for school districts. And what we believe some of the private programs, private tax credit people worked with people who were doing tax preparations to tell them, make sure you tell your clients when you're filling out their income tax form that they now can make a deduction up to April 15th, and I think that led to quite a bit of an increase in the deductions.
And as with everything, there's always a double-edged sword. So this is a positive opportunity for individual school districts, but as we keep in mind, tax credits dollar for dollar out of the general fund. The second part was also a very important aspect to another bill that we'll talk about later. But there was a really great group of Republicans that came together and said, you know what, we need some more accountability as it relates to the student tuition organization tax credits. And so the accountability portion went on to this bill. There was an expansion portion on another, and that was kind of the deal that was made. But I think that we're starting to see some real push for accountability to be had. I know it may be a little bit late, but it's coming nonetheless. And so it includes increased reporting requirements in that student tuition organizations must include annual reports and talk about the amount of scholarships that they have provided to students that meet the National School Lunch and Child Nutrition Act requirements, as well as whose family income meets the 185% threshold or under as it relates to poverty indicators, so that we start getting at least some sunshine and transparency into who's actually receiving these student tuition organization tax credits, and are we supplementing those that are able to afford that, or are we actually supplementing low income? And at least there's, again, at least some sunshine that we've had for a number of years, and it requires that both from the STO as well as the individual STOs to report that on their website. Chapter 225. This is one of the not good bills that passed, Senate Bill 1332. Expands empowerment scholarship accounts to all students who live within the boundaries of Native American lands. Currently, over 70,000 students live on our Indian lands, but do keep in mind that while this expands to all kids that live on Native American lands, there was already the ability to use empowerment scholarship accounts if you're a DRF district, if you're a special education child, if you're in foster care, if you're the offspring of military personnel. So that 70,000 sphere is probably, some of those kids would already have been included within the empowerment scholarship account structure. But having said this is one to keep on the horizon, because there is a statewide cap on the number of kids that can receive empowerment scholarship accounts. However, that goes away in fiscal year 19. In fiscal year 19, then it is opened up to anyone. And why this matters, in addition to the public money going to private schools, is the fact that these are all funded by the state. Every empowerment scholarship account receives 90% of what charter school kids would receive. And so, again, this becomes a financial issue about who we're investing in. And so that's one to keep track of. This is a pretty large expansion. Chapter 226, this basically extends the life of the Alternative Teacher Development Program, Teach for America, through July 1st, 2020, without any dollar amount attached to it. But keep in mind that TFA received $500,000 in budget appropriations. Chapter 248 creates a study committee for the transfer of federal lands into Arizona. Why does this matter for schools? As it relates to, obviously, our state trust lands, we keep track of that because of the resources it provides to augment our classroom site fund monies, but also Arizona is a very, very heavy federal land state. And so which means we have very little property that's actually on our state property roll. So whatever processes the study committee could come up with could have a significant impact on school funding, both on the property tax side as well as the development expansion side. So this committee must submit its report by January 1st, 2020. Obviously, this is a long-term issue, but something that, again, it's amazing how many things touch education, and this is one of them.
Okay, next bill, Chapter 272, House Senate Bill 1259. The next couple of bills are similar to this in terms of what happens in the legislative session. There's a lot of times where the legislature gets a request from one or more school districts to either correct some errors that have been made, to change how their repayments to the state are made or whatever. And it's interesting that the legislature is not allowed to name a particular school district in legislation. So you always can see these bills come through and it'll say in a county with more than X number of students but less than X number of students, and with a district that has more than X number of students but less than, to limit to enough things so it gets down to a specific district. Luckily, Janice is a very good detective, so she's able to go through and figure out which districts those end up. But a lot of times they confess as it goes through, but it won't say the districts. It'll just say the qualifications that districts are eligible to make this change have. But this one allowed districts to recalculate their teacher experience index because of some errors that have been made, and that's Chapter 272. Next one is Chapter 288, House Bill 2567. Again, to impact a particular school district. It happened to be Saddle Mountain Unified School District that overspent their monies a number of years ago. It gave them some changes in how they have to make those payments back to the state, and that did pass. And then the next one is Chapter 289, House Bill 2569. If you'll notice, it's very similar to 1256. One of the districts, Mohawk Valley, qualifies in both of those, but it provides, again, the opportunity for them to recalculate their teacher experience index after March 15th, which is the deadline to correct some errors.
Chapter 290 is a Department of Education bill and really came out of their teacher certification task force. And in talking to a number of superintendents and other school personnel, this is a very good bill and provide at least some flexibility as we continue to deal with the teacher shortage. So it allows the Department of Education to issue a reciprocal teaching certificate for up to 1 year until that applicant has obtained a fingerprint clearance card, as long as the other state has similar criminal history and fingerprinting requirements. So it's basically providing some relief in the time frame issue, especially as the Department of Public Safety gets backed up on some of the fingerprint clearance cards. As long as there is significantly similar requirements, it then allows that person to be in the classroom as they obtain it from Arizona. The other big one is it allows the state board to grant up to 3 years. Currently it's 1 year for a teaching certificate, even if a teacher has not met the structured English immersion or the AEPA proficiency exam. And so I know there's been a lot of superintendents, especially in our rural areas, that have advocated for that. And this did include an emergency clause, so this is effective as we speak. Chapter 296, House Bill 2613, amends various political subdivision statutes, and actually I think this one was really aimed towards the Maricopa Integrated Health ballot measure that happened this past year. But like I said, it applies to almost every political subdivision, including us in 15511, to modify the prohibition on the use of public resources for influencing an election, and you can see the language there. And it states that the prohibition doesn't include routine school district communications. This is one where, you know, it definitely takes a team within the organization. And Chris Thomas, who's here, our legal counsel, looked at this, and obviously it does fuzzy up the language. However, it is very consistent with the advice that we provide to school districts as it relates to good practice. And not towing the line as it relates to using school resources right before you call an election. So definitely probably muddies the water, but nothing inconsistent with what we provide in our trainings and our advice right now. Chapter 299, Senate Bill 1193. This was at the behest of the Charter Schools Association to increase, and frankly, for the last few years, there's been an effort both from the association as well as from the State Board for Charter Schools to increase the rigor and, frankly, shutting down of poor performers of charter schools. And that has been one of their strategic plans, and this is one of the outcomes from that. In requiring charter school sponsors to consider progress towards academic achievement performance as one of the important factors in determining charter renewal. And it requires now, again, more transparency in that the charter sponsors have to submit reports, and it's a number of outlined items within this legislation by December 1st to the Auditor General. And as we've said, the State Board for Charter Schools has become much more aggressive in really holding charter authorizers and sponsors' feet to the fire for whatever contract, both in their academic as well as financial contracts are, and ensuring that they uphold them or be put on probation and then subsequently shut down if improvements not made. Chapter 300. Wow. Senate Bill 1459. This is seclusion restraint. We saw this bill a couple of years ago, and now it is back. There is a big thank you really goes out to Denise Lolbrett, who did a lot of work on this to try to get a process that made sense for school districts, make it the least onerous as possible while still trying to mitigate some advocate concerns. So it allows the use of seclusion or restraint if there is imminent danger of bodily harm to the student or others, and as well as less restrictive interventions are not sufficient to mitigate those efforts. So you have to meet both thresholds before seclusion or restraint can be used. And I should back up. The significance of this bill and why this bill was a big challenge for us is that previous legislation specifically talked about special education students. This legislation is for all students. And so it created a lot of challenges in how we deal with seclusion and restraint. They're very different issues as it relates to some special education needs versus if a kid is getting a fight or school resource officers are involved. They're completely different things that we had to make work in the same bill. So it creates a requirement for the use of restraint or seclusion. Those are specified within statute, and it creates reporting and documentation procedures. And one of the biggest concerns that we had is that as part of the requirements for the use of restraint or seclusion is that a trained professional needs to be the first person to initiate any kind of seclusion or restraint techniques. However, if that trained person is not available and it's an emergency situation, then it allows someone else to intervene. Well, we were obviously concerned about the litigation issue, about someone that is acting in good faith and good intention, and God forbid something happens to that student. And we had worked very hard to get some kind of immunity or gross negligence clause in there, and unfortunately we're unsuccessful with a couple of other things that were going on, some politics going on at the time. We were successful, though, and very appreciative. As I said, there was only about 15 bills that the governor did in totality with bills that he signed, and one of them is this one, and talked about that this legislation would benefit by considering some protections for those individuals acting in good faith in emergency situations. And what's not included in your slide, urge the parties to get together and provide that legislation next session. So we'll continue to work on that in the meantime. But that's one of those that has a lot of legal implications, and I know Chris will talk at the end about policies, but that's probably a policy-heavy bill. Chapter 301, this House Bill 2153 expands the corporate scholarship tax credit to allow any S corporations and limited liability companies to make donations. So there are two student tuition organization tax credits, one for individuals, one for corporations. The corporations is capped at $5 million, but this expands the entities that can take advantage of that tax. And this was one of those issues that this was the companion issue to the increased transparency that we saw previously in House Bill 2483. Chapter 302, Notice of Claim Public Schools. This basically includes charter schools and the notice of claim requirements. School districts are already included. Chapter 309 allows the JTED Governing Board to contract with a charter located within the boundaries of a JTED to offer career and technical education courses or programs as a satellite campus. I think we felt that this was done in the budget a couple of years ago, but this provides clarification that that is in fact allowed. And I know that there is, I know this has been an issue with school districts and charter schools, but this is providing kids that go to charter schools that same opportunity to take advantage of career and technical education courses.
Okay, the next bill, Chapter 310, House Bill 2479. This was a bill by the EFRG group, the Education Finance Reform Group. I know Jeremy and the other people on that group worked hard, and their lobbyist Megan did a lot of hard work on it. It basically tries to take some things that would give schools more flexibility and update some of the statutes that would deal with school districts. You can see allow county school superintendents to make electronic transfers rather than drawing hard paper warrants, and provide some flexibility for monies that can be placed with the county school superintendent, allows student activity monies and auxiliary operations fund monies to be distributed by a county warrant for school districts rather than through the private checking account. And then the next slide, which deals with 2479 in a little more detail. The first one was a thing that was added near the end by a couple of the bond attorneys wanted us to try and get this added if we could. And basically, the voters a number of years ago approved an initiative that eliminated the secondary property tax. So you have a primary tax value, and you no longer have a secondary property tax value. And all the primary and secondary rates are applied against the same value. There was an issue that were raised by a couple of bond attorneys about the debt limit, because under that proposal, you had a full cash value for a property, and then you had the limited value where property couldn't grow more than 5% a year. And if the change that was put in House Bill 2479 wasn't included, then school districts would have a lower limit and a different limit to calculate their debt limit than the other political subdivisions in the state. So this change in how the values for debt limits get calculated, again, to remind people there is no longer any secondary property values. Everything's going to be based off of a primary value, but the primary value does have a limited and an unlimited. The debt limit would be still calculated against the full cash value.
Another provision that was added on to 2479 was allowing the Department of Education to use up to $500,000 for the Move On When Reading or the K-3 reading program. And so what happened in the budget was that the $40 million appropriated for the K-3 reading program was moved from the State Board of Education to the Department of Education. However, none of the technical assistance or administration funds were authorized. And so this was in the cleanup from the budget to allow the department to actually be able to administer those funds. So this was a pretty significant issue to take care of. And then there was also the issue of there's this quite elite soccer camp that has kids from all over the world that come, and there was an issue about tuition. And Casa Grande Union had an issue with that. It took care of their items so that they made sure to get paid for educating those students, even though those students come from all across the world in order to participate in the soccer camp. But I want to echo on this bill what Chuck said, that there was some last-minute heroics in order to get this thing done. And EFRG and Megan Bellartino really, really worked very diligently to make this happen. So some significant issues for schools on it. Last but not least is Chapter 316, House Bill 2516, requiring the State Board of Education to adopt rules for continuing education credits as it relates to child abuse and the sexual abuse of children. If you remember, there was a similar bill last year that kind of got bogged down. It was much more expansive to what was being included in there, but this specifically relates to continuing education credits. So with that is all of the bills that were passed. As I said, Jeff Esposito, he has the best job in the land in the fact that he gets to put together the 2015 wrap-up brief, and that will be out to you by the end of this week. And this is the comprehensive. So all the bills that we talked about that were passed, but also the ones that were vetoed, the ones that got lost in the process, as well as those that never received a hearing, that will be out to you this afternoon. He does a really great job on it, and I know it's a very, very important resource for all folks.
Janice, I don't ever remember hearing Jeff say that he has the best job. Well, he's here. Can we ask him?
Notice I'm not letting him answer.
Okay, all right.
I plead the fifth.
And that end of the week deadline.
Yeah,
Came right forward.
And then the last part is that obviously, legislation is legislation, but how does that get translated to your day-to-day operations at the school district? And so we have the best policy services in the country. It's been said over a number of years. Other states look to us for that, and so we'll turn it over to Chris to talk about when you can expect those policy updates from the legislation.
Thanks, Janice.
I'll just echo real quickly what was said before, that sometimes, you measure your success, especially with organizations such as ours that, from the ASBO side that wants as much flexibility as possible, from the ASBA side that wants to limit or maximize local control. I mean, so much of what we accomplish in a legislative session is not seen in a session like this where we're talking about bills that pass. So many of the bills that, so many of the accomplishments of this session are bills that did not pass that would have intruded on local control or limited our flexibility and increased mandates. So really a great session from that angle, and show up on this slideshow. But it definitely, from a policy perspective, that means less things that we have to write, and that's exactly it. For this year, we expect very few policy advisories, only a handful. As Janice mentioned, the biggest one that we will have to write to is that restraint and seclusion legislation, Senate Bill 1459, which will require some substantial changes. We're going to take this advantage or this time because of some changes made to the extracurricular tax credit law in terms of what you can use the money for, to rewrite a good portion of that particular policy, because in the last year or so, there's also been some guidance that's come out from the Department of Revenue on that as well. So look for that change. That's significant. And we'll also be taking a look at the charter school credits and how those get absorbed by the district. In addition, we work closely with the Arizona Risk Retention Trust. They help highlight issues for us. And it's fortuitous that they let us know about a suggestion that they had that we will be writing for, and it has to do with supervision of students by school staff and whether or not reasonable proximity, reasonable proximity is required, but we will define that a little bit more narrowly and also give an allowance for a good faith effort if a school staff member has left students from their supervision, to make sure that someone else is supervising those students. So those are just a handful of the policy advisories that we will be coming out with. I will also take this opportunity to make mention that ASBA's policy bridge is up and rolling. It is in its infancy, so we are learning more and more about what the system does and what you wished it could do. So we are making adjustments as we go, and taking notes for revisions later on that will make the system work even better. But right now, we're very pleased with the rollout, and we're working closely with you all to make sure that you understand how to use it for its full potential. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Janice and Chuck for the question and answer part.
Okay, as we're getting set up to look at some of the questions, I just have a couple brief announcements to make. The first one is the session today has been recorded. And unless Janice and I go through and find some mistakes that we made, that as it is recorded, it'll be posted on our website, so you can view the recording, or if someone didn't have the opportunity to view the presentation today. Second thing is, just for a future announcement, at our May 13th ASBO bi-monthly meeting, we've talked to Chris Cable, and in our afternoon breakout session, she's going to come with some of her staff, or at least with Chris, to kind of go over the budget forms and talk about the changes for putting the budget together. So mark May 13th on your calendar for the next ASBO bi-monthly meeting.
All right. Can you clarify why there is not a 2% increase in funding if the lawsuit required it?
Well, the lawsuit required basically that the legislature fund inflation or 2%, whichever is greater. So you would only fund 2% if the inflation actually went beyond 2%. So the legislature did meet the requirement. Now, and Chris could comment if he wanted, that there's back payments for the years that the legislature didn't fund inflation of $330 billion that the court ruled that they haven't decided on. But you're either going to get going forward under Prop 301, or in the past from Prop 301, inflation or 2%. But the only time 2% would come into effect if inflation was greater than 2%, then it's limited to a 2% increase.
Right, and what is at issue still at the court is, and under appeal, is how you calculate that percentage. Does it include all of the increases that should have been given during the years in which inflation was not provided? And so the state is appealing that. The back pay issue is still before Judge Cooper at the Superior Court. And I think it's no secret to everyone, we are involved in very robust and substantive conversations, mediation on the lawsuit right now. We are under a gag order and cannot disclose any of the content of those negotiations, but they are substantive and they are proceeding, and we do believe that we will have some news to tell in the next few weeks.
This is Chuck Hesing. I should have made, when I talked about they were fully funding inflation, that was not including the years when they didn't fund inflation, not adjusting the base level going forward, but when they had started refunding inflation, they funded it for the last couple of years, but there's a big difference between what that number should be had they made up for the years that they didn't fund inflation versus just going forward.
Okay, for A and B districts, should they hold their public hearing at the proposed or adopted meeting? And for A and B districts, you can do it at either one.
Yeah, you can do it either one. In fact, I've been told that a couple of districts have already scheduled, and they do it as a separate hearing. And I don't know how the Auditor General, but I probably should say that we're not the deciders on this. Wasn't it George Bush who said that he was the decider on different things or whatever? The Auditor General and the Department of Ed would decide on all the specifics, but it would seem to me that, and I think Janice agrees, as you look at it, you schedule that hearing whenever you want, or you could do it as part of your budget process. If you're a C or D or F district, it would be hard to include it in your budget hearings because you'd have to have a 30-day period of time where you wouldn't be able to do anything.
Exactly. I mean, the issue with A and B districts is it needs to be a public hearing. The actual cuts have to be discussed, and the governing board members have to sign off on that. So you can actually, you know, the intention from the governor's office as well as the legislature is that there's a public vetting and that there's a sign-off. So for A and B, you really have a lot of flexibility. And it goes to the second question that we have here. For C, D, and F districts, does the 30 days have to take place before the board adopts the budget, since they will be signing off on the hearing and comments? And absolutely, you need to provide that 30-day time period, and specifically within the session law is the fact that the governing board has to consider the community input. So not only do you have to comply with that 30 days, you actually have to show contemplation of the input that's been provided before you do a final adoption. Okay, are districts supposed to use the same funds as the Auditor General's office uses when computing the percentage of spending in the district's budget, or just M&O and food services?
Well, you would use the same definitions that the Auditor General uses, I believe, because that's basically what they're referring back to. So you would use and the Auditor General does have on their website how that's calculated, but it would be all the funds that are included, not just selected funds.
Okay, for JTEDs, a couple of JTED questions. For JTEDs, does that mean that if a student enrolls in a central program that the district ADM will be reduced for the time the student is in a central program?
Well, for a JTED and a central district program, anytime the district only gets credit for the time that the student spends in the traditional district program. And then the JTED gets credit for the time that they spend in the central campus. What the law will do is for the central campus programs, and this is separate from the satellite programs, central campus programs, the JTED for the central campus ADM will only get 92.5% of what the funding they would normally get through the formula. The traditional district on a central campus program will still get 100% of whatever funding they would qualify for the time that the student spends in the local district program. That's different than on a satellite program. And on a satellite program, both the traditional district and the JTED only get 92.5% of the funding they would get for that program.
And Chuck elaborates on that, because that's the next question is, last night at Pima County Collaborative, and we had a long discussion about this. There was reference made that this also applied to students taking career and technical education courses offered by the school district. So that 92.5% is both from the JTED satellite as well as school districts, but the even though it's 92.5%, it's a much bigger percentage for school districts.
Technically, it probably is. And the nice, I guess the good thing about it is, since this doesn't take effect until 2017, there would be room for the legislature to consider some corrections if it's not being done the way they had thought it was going to be done.
Okay, next question is, charter school special education enrollment has most likely increased due to district-sponsored charter schools. Okay, that was a comment, actually. When will ADE be issuing detailed instructions related to the district additional assistance reduction presentations, comment period, and forms that the governing board must sign?
The first thing is that it's not the Department of Ed's choice. It's the only option they have. Is the way the legislature has done it the last few years. Instead of specifying what the reduced dollar amount per student would be in the formula, they tell the Department of Ed, you calculate how much the cut would be for each district to save X amount of dollars. And the Department of Ed can't actually do that calculation until they get all the districts' budgets in. So what they have been trying to do is get as close as they can on an estimate, but you won't know exactly what the specific reduction is for district additional assistance in each individual district until they get all the budget information in and recalculate it. At least now with the idea of about a 15% reduction, about 15% of the dollars being left in district additional assistance is the best estimate they can do at this point. But the way the law is, you still won't know exactly what your reduction in district additional assistance is till the Department of Ed gets everybody's budget in and calculates the exact cut they have to make to save the state the $352 million.
Can we carry forward any of our fiscal year 15 student success monies into fiscal year 16?
That's something we'll have to get an answer from the Department of Ed and the Auditor General's office. One of the things is that fund would no longer exist. But what we will do is we will ask that specific question of the Auditor General's office because they would be the ones who would they'd be the decider on that.
Okay, the answer is yes, traditional public schools can be members of the Arizona Public Schools Achievement District as well as charters. It's going to be open to both of them, but as we said, we still are a little bit light on the details of how that actually is accomplished. Is there any guidance on what the flexibility is on teacher evaluation? And I think that question is related to Senate Bill 1289. And there's two specific areas that flexibility is provided, but again, it has to be proactively done by the school district as an alternative policy, and it relates to dismissal and non-renewal procedures that were put forward for ineffective and developing teachers and principals, and so that 2-year period, there's flexibility provided there, and it's specifically related to data concerns as it relates to AZ merit, especially if you have a Group A teacher, and what kind of confidence that you have in your local assessments to substitute for that as far as your Group B teachers and others. And obviously, you know, many are using school-specific information as it relates to the A through F accountability system. That's now been put on hold for 2 years. So in essence, you can't really put on hold any of the dismissal non-renewal items. The other item has to do with the individual performance pay measure that went into effect this year, and I think that there was concerns, especially with the lack of investment that's been happening within K-12 schools, that we want to ensure that those resources from Prop 301, from the Classroom Site Fund, are able to be disseminated to teachers, even if there is some lack of confidence in the data portion of the teacher and principal evaluation. So those are the two specific areas. There's nothing else specific on it, but since that questions was asked, I will say the State Board of Education is reconfiguring, or not reconfiguring, what are they doing? Regrouping the teacher and principal task force next month to start taking a look at the framework that was adopted in 2010 and really taking a look at the data portion and what is acceptable and not acceptable, because I think we've learned a lot in the past 5 years about student learning objectives and some other items, and so that will be coming out from the state board side, but not legislatively. All right, Chuck, when will the tax credit reports be due to the Department of Revenue? Currently, they are due February 28th. If we can receive contributions through April 15th, is this changed to being due June 30th at the end of the fiscal year?
I just made a note to myself, we'll have to get in touch with the Department of Revenue to talk about that. And also, what documentation are they going to expect because of when people make that contribution, let's say on April 14th, before they submit their taxes, well, what advice will the Department of Revenue give, and how will they want districts to report that information? We have some time on that because obviously it's not going to happen until next year, but at least we can get the Department of Revenue to maybe issue some guidance on that.
Okay, there's a couple questions on the certification bill on House Bill 2577. Since that bill had an emergency clause, will that impact currently certified staff who are set to expire at the end of this year? I need to get an exact date on that because it was one of the final years or final bills of the year. But yes, I mean, it's an emergency clause. It takes effect upon the governor's signature, and that takes immediate effect. And then there was also a question about a teacher coming from another state has up to 3 years to get their SEI, their Structured English Immersion endorsement, and pass the teacher certification assessment. Yes, that is the case, and that is the intention with that bill. Regarding the bill on political work for bonds and overrides, does ASBA provide training and guidance for PAC members?
Yes, we do. We provide 15.511 trainings. If you have a PAC, if you have an organization, a PTO, or something like that, a committee that's doing that kind of work, we will certainly come out and do training for you on the limitations on the use of school resources to influence the outcome of the election.
Okay, there's a question about what was the double-edged sword comment regarding 2483 about tax credits and dollar for dollar coming out of the general budget. That's my comments. Basically, that if you're an individual school district, there's the ability to receive more monies for your individual district through getting tax credits for that additional period of time. However, keep in mind that every tax credit that goes to specific districts or privates or what have you, any kind of tax credit is $1 taken out of the state general fund, which also impacts education funding. So at some point, we're going to have to make a bigger pie. If I understand correctly, there's a full cash value on the primary property tax side that should be used for the arms? Oh, for the bonds and overrides. A little limited primary should be used for the regular budget.
Well, for setting the tax rate, the assessed valuation will be the limited value, and that's the one where properties can't go up more than 5% in a year. Full cash value will be the value of the property without that 5% limit. So it'll always be higher than the one because it won't have that 5% limit. The one with the 5% limit will be used for the tax rates. The tax rate will be set against that limited value. Probably the bond attorneys, our understanding, have been taking and talking and deciding exactly where we go forward on this. But the thought was that the full cash value is the one that would be used without the 5% limit to determine what the debt limit is for a school district. But your bond attorney or your financial advisor, you probably ought to check with them to get their interpretation.
Will you please clarify in House Bill 2479 what is meant by removes the $100,000 qualifier from consideration when determining whether a district is required to hold a public hearing to revise a budget in excess of the budget limit?
We'll have to go back and take a look and make sure we get the specifics on that, the way it finally ended up.
Okay, let's see. We just have a couple more. This is a good question, an important one. Is there a penalty for not holding a hearing on the classroom site fund or for providing more dollars into the classroom?
I don't think there is, but what normally happens if people don't do that, then it will get reported to the legislature, and they'll make some kind of punitive proposal to make it a lot more difficult. So I would think that this was something that districts worked with the legislature on to get that definition broadened to include student support and instructional support. So you ought to have that, and you could the governing board can still do whatever they want to do. Even the ones that have a C, D, or F, it just says you must consider what people say, and then you could have the meeting and say this is what was suggested. Here's why we decided that won't work, or why that's not appropriate for our district. But I would just, history has shown what happens is it only takes a couple of districts not to do something that the legislature asks them or dictates to them to do, and then they come back with something that makes it a lot more punitive and a lot more with a penalty involved.
Yeah, and I'm just going to echo that. I mean, there's a lot of work done in order to provide that flexibility, and frankly, this is an item that we're going to see carried through into the future. And I think one of the items that we have heard from a number of districts is the fact of how strict the instruction pot of money is, and the fact that we were able to get instruction, instructional support, and student support. There really shouldn't be a reason to not have that public conversation, because actually it would probably be a benefit to you and your community to really have them have a very strong understanding of what it takes in order to be successful within your district. The set aside the governor made for the best school district was $24 million, and half of that has to go to low-income students. Is there any criteria on how the other $12 million will be provided to non-low-income schools?
Well, I don't think, for clarity, I don't think it says low-income students. It said it has to be located in an area with low-income students. So that'll be interesting to see how somebody actually defines that. Right. But when I first looked at it, it's the geographic area where you're going to locate that charter school, not who actually goes to that charter school. It'll be interesting to see how the ruling on that works out.
All right, we have quite a few questions about the discrepancy between Senate Bill 1289, which provides for a transition period with letter grades, so that there will be no letter grades issued this year or next year, and the requirement that's in the fiscal year 16 budget as it relates to A and B districts to hold a meeting with their to talk about the district additional assistant cuts as well as C, D, and F. For purposes of district additional assistance, your letter grade that you currently have will be the decider for what process that you need to follow for the district additional assistance cuts. So we understand there is a discrepancy. However, that will be the grade just for this year. Keep in mind that language was session law because this was a cut just for fiscal year 16. Do you want to add, Chuck?
No.
Oh, okay. I think we have time for just a couple more questions. I know
there is one up there. ASBA, or I originally sent out an estimate about $120 per student for the additional would be left after the additional cut for district additional assistance. And working with the Department of Ed and now seeing all the variables put together, we're basically changing and saying there's two ways for you to estimate what you'll have left or what your reduction will be to district additional assistance. Is if your district with 1,100 or fewer students, they should figure they'll have about 29% of their district additional assistance formula left after the cuts. For the rest of the districts, the best guess is to figure you only have about 15% of your district additional assistance formula left after the cut. And that's probably a more refined and more accurate than the $120 estimate we originally came out with.
Okay, Chuck, will the percentage of classroom spending be included on the budget forms, or will districts have to prepare their own document?
I believe the Auditor General will probably include that on the budget forms because it says that something that will be there. But that'll be up to the Auditor General and the Department of Ed where they put it. But I would think that that'll be there somewhere.
And just one more, because I know there's a lot of comments about what the process needs to look like for a C, D, and F district as it relates to the 30-day comment period. Specifically in the legislation, it requires a public meeting to talk about what the proposed district additional budget cuts will be, and then you have to have a 30-day time period to solicit input. So if that wants to be on your website, if that's through email, if that's through having a study session, that's really not defined in there, except that you have to hold a meeting to begin with, provide 30 days, and then consider that again before final budget adoption. Chuck, did you have any other?
Nope. Thank everybody for participating, and we hope that we answered at least some of your questions. I want to thank all the people from ASBA who were here. We never did get a final word from Jeff that he has the best job in the world or whatever, but we'll assume that his silence means that he does. Okay, anybody have anything else they want to add? We want to thank EJ Nicely, Ernie Nicely from Nicely Done again for helping us and making sure that all the pieces fit together and work. So have a good day.